Okay, welcome to our lecture today. I just want to point out a small discrepancy in the handout. The handout is an older version of a talk from, well, it's not the correct handout. There are some discrepancies, but if you follow through the lecture, we'll make sure to upload the new handout on the website after the lecture today. Okay, so can you hear me? Can you? Yeah? Can you hear me now? Okay. All right, so I was just saying that that the handout is not very accurate. If you just follow through the lecture, and then the updated handout will be, we'll upload it on the website after the lecture today. Okay, so the lecture today is on enlightenment. And what I want to try to do in the lecture is to point out to the very important stakes in thinking about the specific theme of the course. Why so? The stakes are high for how we interpret enlightenment, which is a social and intellectual phenomenon that is seen to have introduced dangerous new forms of thought that threaten the basic structures of authority, tradition, faith, and privilege on which the Ancien Regime society rested. So the enlightenment of reason, as we may call it, had the main declared aim of destroying prejudice and asserting the human as a rational animal. However, some Enlightenment thinkers have probably underestimated the strength of certain prejudices, both religious and social, and perhaps failed to realize how old prejudices are easily replaced by new ones. Enlightenment has been submitted to many rejections and accusations, the cost of which has been a general abandonment of its ideals of freedom and universality. The most essential fundamental proposition in Enlightenment thought, one we saw already taking seed in Rousseau's writings, I think last week, is that history is not an impersonal force that realizes itself in the world, but that it is the product of man's action and activity. For Enlightenment thinkers, what is most important or most precious in history is the signs of man's progress, or the progressive liberation of the human spirit, its fight and struggle against the forces which oppress and have oppressed it. In other words, the 18th century, or the Age of Enlightenment, not only sought to explain the world, but also to transform the world by explaining it. Condorcet, who you will be looking at in this section of the course, optimistically believed that progress is by no means inevitable and fatal, but that the history of humanity shows that it is in fact real. And to quote from Condorcet, a question that he asks, is it not reasonable to admit that humanity, which has known how to conquer spiritual liberty, scientific truth, and political liberty, will not repudiate its conquests and will not abandon the enlightening power of reason, end of quote. Condorcet outlines 10 successive epochs of human history's advance from brute simplicity to scientific enlightenment. According to him, Descartes closed the 8th epoch, which extends from the invention of printing to the time when science and philosophy shook off the yoke of authority. That the 9th epoch, for Condorcet, extends from Descartes until the founding of the French Republic, and that the 10th epoch covers the future progress of the human mind. So the aim of Condorcet's sketch was to provide an account or a history of the necessary ideas that are the ideas that would be necessary for maintaining a democratic and republican faith, one that largely inspired the 18th century. The two great events for Condorcet were the American and French Revolution, which symbolized the triumph, according to him, of philosophy over prejudice and liberty over despotism. Ultimately, Condorcet expresses a specific spirit of enlightenment, a commitment to the future, which is the 10th epoch that he outlines, a faith in progress, the preponderance of the future over the past, of action over inheritance, and of reason over tradition. So for him, the French Revolution had to be or succeeded in becoming a radical revolution. It is this very radicalism that gives it a decisive importance in the history of humanity. It concludes the history of liberation for Condorcet and initiates the coming age of liberty. So for Condorcet, again, it is with the French Revolution, to quote from him, that humanity or reason acquired full possession of itself. Henceforth, man is master of himself, of his actions, and of his future. Of the future, he will select and determine for himself by his own reflective, conscious behavior. It is because of this that in the 10th epoch, humanity will come into a time when it will consciously pursue progress. And this is an idea that resonates with Rousseau's notion of the perfectibility of the human. If you recall for Rousseau, the social contract is always already contrived. It's never given by nature, and thus it offers humanity a chance towards perfecting itself. Condorcet proceeds to stress the importance of public instruction, of education, and of the importance of building public institutions to safeguard the legacy of the revolution. Instead of thinking about the Constitution as a sacred text, he proposed permanent institutions as the guardians of society. For him, the past does not dominate the present, and the present does not command the future. No one has the right to legislate for the future. Hence, he has this famous plan for what was called the Girondist Constitution, which would transform fundamentally France into a society of permanent debating club, and which was ultimately rejected by the very revolution that Condorcet believed in. And he was writing precisely the sketch that you're looking at while he was fleeing death that was the death that was proclaimed on him by the Jacobins. So this said, Enlightenment, as you will see in the reading selections we have put together for you, was already a project that was originally split into two camps. A radical camp, which insisted on the separation of faith and reason, in which I would place Rousseau, Condorcet, and Kant, in line with Spinoza, Diderot, and others, and a more moderate or conservative camp, which attempted to reconcile faith and reason in support of a modernized monarchy or an ecclesiastical authority, in which we could place Hobbes, Locke, Bacon, Voltaire, Montaigne, and Hume, perhaps. The midwife of radical enlightenment essentially came from philosophy. Philosophy provided the pamphleteers, journalists, elected deputies of the American, French, Dutch, Italian, and other revolutions of 1770, 1780, and 1790 with slogans, maxims, and ideologies in order to justify a fundamental break with the past. And philosophy was in turn itself affected by these social transformations. The overthrow of altar, throne, and nobility was the aim that would only stem from the transformation in the people's way of thinking. Most importantly, the Enlightenment posited a fundamental link between the revolution of mind, of thought, and of thinking, and political revolution. And as you will see in Kant and Condorcet's texts, intellectual discovery itself was to be affirmed as a salutary pursuit for that purpose. It is important to note that the Enlightenment universals are essentially premised on fissures or on breaks and splits. Thought is possible through radical doubt, as you saw with Descartes. Cogito and madness are somehow intertwined. Descartes is always obsessed with how can I tell the difference between me hallucinating and thinking, between dreaming and thinking. Rationality can only be practiced through a recognition of its very limits with Kant, as you will see shortly in this coming weeks. Freedom and autonomy can only be achieved through a heteronymous act of recognizing the law as what is external to the self. This is what Kant will call the categorical imperative, which is a recognition of a law or a standard that is external to the self. The subject is only human because of language, which in turn proves impossible to turn into a science, a matter that figures ranging from Condillac to Herder to Diderot were considering at the time. And ironically, the Enlightenment that proposes itself as the rebirth of humankind closes with Hegel's declarations of the end of history, the end of philosophy, and the end of art. So even though Enlightenment was a European phenomenon, it should not be reduced to a claim for the superiority and integrity of European values. Rather, Enlightenment, as we will see in Kant and Condorcet's texts, is not reducible to any identity position, neither Western nor European nor other. It is not reducible to a subjective position. Rather, Enlightenment is precisely about relating negatively to oneself for the purpose of an openness to all others. So in a sense, Enlightenment posits a cut, an irreducible divide within any subjective particular position. It is, as Kant will tell us, about the participation in what he calls a universal ethico-political principle that is accessible to everyone. In other words, Enlightenment is a demand for universality and a transcendence of particularities. So we can venture to say somehow that it is about accepting a certain sense of homelessness as the truest of all fates. Some of the key figures of Enlightenment thought emerge from within the German context in Europe, but are influential for and influenced by the French and American revolutions primarily. In the course of the 17th and 18th centuries, Europe witnessed the rise of a modern bourgeois society, which, although released man from the fetters of feudalism, chained him into an image of the natural and social worlds as machines made of parts, and in which the individual served merely as a cog in the machine. The naturalization of this mechanical understanding of the world, which is exemplified for you in Francis Bacon's works that you have already looked at in the course, and the fixed laws that were revealed to govern the solar system since Copernicus, once projected onto human society in the ideas of the Leviathan, the Hobbesian and Lockean social contracts, and Smithian political economy, proved to be highly problematic. Kant describes this mechanization of the social world as a state in which, to quote from Kant, immaturity has become natural to man, or dotage, which was the original translation of the world, or nonage, again as the second translation of the world, is a situation in which only rules and formulas epitomize the use of reason and suppress its potentials to free man. This does not mean, however, that Kant did not recognize the real machine-like attributes of man. We are indeed finite beings who are not essentially free, but bound into a chain of causal determination or a nexus of cause and effect, have no autonomy, and are simply thinking machines. But the question for Kant was, what do we do with this knowledge of our own finitude, our own machine-like existence? In a manner similar to Descartes, the finite being for Kant is limited, but reason is infinite, because its limits are internal to itself. These are not empirical limits, i.e. reason is theoretically infinite. It is an a priori to empirical knowledge. Recognizing the limits of reason for Kant is to be understood as the limiting of pure speculation that has no self-guiding structure. So a quote from Kant, and again, I apologize, it's right there. Because, however, human reason always strives for freedom, when it first breaks its fetters, the first use it makes of its long unaccustomed freedom has to degenerate into a misuse and presumptuous trust of its faculties from all limitations, leading to the persuasion of the sole authority of speculative reason, which assumes nothing except what it can justify by objective grounds and dogmatic conviction. First quote from Kant. Thus, enlightenment is a position or a stance of critique, one that demands that we think for ourselves, according to Kant, even if it means thinking against ourselves, against what we naturally take to be constitutive of our very own subjectivities. A second quote from Kant, thinking for oneself means seeking the supreme touchstone of truth in oneself, i.e., in one's own reason. And the maxim of always thinking for oneself is enlightenment. To make use of one's reason means no more than to ask oneself, whenever one is supposed to assume something, whether one could find it feasible to make the ground or the rule in which one assumes it into a universal principle for the use of reason, end of quote. So the legacy of enlightenment can be precisely summed up in Kant's own words. Enlightenment is the exit from self-incurred immaturity, from the inability to speak for oneself to that of autonomous self-determination. The word Unmündigkeit, the specific word that Kant uses, is derived from Mund, or mouth, or a certain mouthliness, which means that you are entitled or able to use your own mouth as you wish, meaning you are able to speak and be a full citizen, also in the legal sense, meaning maturity. So in the response to the question, what is enlightenment, and the increasingly pressing questions of the 18th century concerning the nature of political authority and the question of human freedom, Kant made a proposition for what enlightenment should or ought to mean, and not a proposition for what enlightenment already is. Enlightenment, as he proposed it in the text you will be reading this week, points like a vector to a path of continuous intellectual pursuit, despite all obstacles and in recognition of them. It is a trajectory of, in a sense, a purposeless purposiveness. If I am indeed a thinking machine, Kant tells us, if I am indeed an automaton, then that may be my only grounds for freedom. So this emptying out of the human person in Enlightenment thought of all substantial content is precisely where this category of the subject emerges for Kant, or what you will come to hear about as the transcendental subject, This transcendental subject is not reducible to a person. It is somewhat a pure subject, a doll-like thing which speaks. Think of the emergence of the Enlightenment figures of monsters, of Frankenstein in specific. Is it not curious that in the moment in which Enlightenment thought obsessed with the relationship between nature and culture, that we see the emergence of such monsters? Frankenstein somehow comes to embody a missing link between nature and culture. When Enlightenment sought to produce a man or woman of culture that could somehow conserve an unspoiled nature, the monster emerged. The monster emerges at the moment of emergence of the knowing subject, precisely because of the ambiguity of the questions of origins, nature or culture, the origins of language, of society. The tragedy of the monster who ends up excluded from nature and culture alike, but whose monstrosity is the monstrosity of culture. Frankenstein can be thought of as the noble savage, the self-educated man who turns into a monster because society rejects him. He's not offered a social contract, ends up destroying everyone around him, including himself. In a way, the Kantian subject is this kind of Frankensteinian monster. If only it could exist, then it would amend the great chain of being, fill the break between matter and spirit, nature and culture. But then when we try to cover this break, this gap, the slack, all we get is horror. We get these monsters. But it's a touching horror after all. Frankenstein has a positive aspect. He's not the catastrophic result of Enlightenment, but the possibility of another nature, a sublime nature that gets lost in the mechanical, clockwork-like universe. He can only be present through the effort to represent the unrepresentable, what is lost from scientific endeavor. The uncanniness of Frankenstein and other Enlightenment monsters speaks for the limits of Enlightenment and the limits of interpretation for Kant's subject. The transcendental subject for Kant in the Critique of Pure Reason is precisely this kind of no thing. It is a point it needs to be assumed as a kind of an a priori condition that we must presuppose in order to explain how certain perceptions can be unified into intelligible knowledge claims about the world. But this does not mean that it can itself be known like the things that it knows, this transcendental subject. It is always subject to a gaze from elsewhere. Think of Frankenstein and how he could never endure the image of himself in the mirror. After this digression into monsters as the expressions of the limits of Enlightenment, let us get closer to the text itself. The importance of rereading figures like Kant today lies in understanding his text as an ethical and pedagogical exposition. The question, what is Enlightenment, was initially put forth by a theologian and educational reformer in December 1783, while questioning the advisability of civil marriage ceremonies in Germany. Zollner received responses in the newspapers from Moses Mendelssohn and Immanuel Kant and multiple other figures. The debate in the newspapers centered on the issue of how much enlightenment of the citizenry was possible or desirable, and at what cost. It lasted for more than 10 years, this debate in the press, and by the time that Louis XVI was executed after the outbreak of the French Revolution, the question of enlightenment became intertwined with whether enlightenment undermined public authority and necessarily led to political turmoil. It is important to clarify that Kant's response to the question, what is enlightenment, in 1784, was in no way posed in a reflexive manner. Kant was not simply reflecting on the question. In other words, he was not making the usual argument that is salient in our world, that knowledge is a reflective act, that simply sheds light on the world, making it more visible to sight. Rather, for Kant, knowing is not simply about seeing, but about speaking without fear, without self-incurred cowardice and immaturity. And this is precisely what Kant, the philosopher, was doing. From his home in Königsberg, he wrote a journalistic essay meant for the newspapers and the public. Kant, in this specific text, acted as a public intellectual himself. In it, he spoke actively in the world, rather than remaining bound to the position of a scholar in a closed academic or bounded academy. So the public use of reason was somehow put into practice in the very nature and dissemination of Kant's text. Although enlightenment as a word bears the meaning of illumination, in the text you are reading this week, Kant does not invoke images of light. Instead, he invokes images of speech, and discourse as the most essential elements of enlightenment for him. What he demanded was not simply a world in which everything stood naked in the light of knowledge, but one in which it was possible to speak without fear. Thus, the question for Kant was about the very limits of cognition, of thinking, and its possibilities. The question is, what can I know for Kant? In other words, knowledge for Kant does not only involve seeing, like scientific knowledge does not only involve empirical observation, but knowing is not some form of inner light either. It's not introspective. Rather, its most important aspect is that it involves language, speaking or discourse with and for others. Now, seeing and speaking are two very different acts in the world. Free speech, as we will see with Kant, is not reducible simply to the liberal idea of free individuality and expression of opinion. Free speech, rather for him, is not simply about being free to have an opinion, but about being free to use one's understanding. This is premised on the following steps from the Critique of Judgment. 1, to think for oneself. 2, to think from the standpoint of everyone else. And 3, to think always consistently. Only by being proficient at the first 2 can we be proficient at the third. Kant claimed that we can only think freely if we think for ourselves in the company of others. And this is, again, not a matter of formulating opinions, but of formulating judgments. Thus, Kant does not adhere to the idea of introspection as a mode of thought. Philosophical thought that was rooted in reflection, before Kant proposes this category of a transcendental subject, is best conceived of in terms of a process of mirroring, by which knowledge is understood as secondary representation of being, and being is seen to exist somehow in itself. Although knowledge simply understood as a mirror provides the subject with an image from the perspective of an other, there is still a complicity of one's own viewpoint in the introspective paradigm. What Kant wanted to do is introduce an objectivity that is totally alien to the conventional space of introspection, to the conventional space of thinking conceived as a mirror reflection. For Kant, this reflective posture that preceded him was based on an optical delusion. His critical gesture was that he revealed that the past and perhaps future methods of introspection were premised on reflection, were only optical delusions. This is a quote from Kant. Formerly, I viewed human common sense only from the standpoint of my own. Now I put myself into the position of another's reason outside of myself and observe my judgments, together with their most secret causes, from the point of view of others. It is true that the comparison of both observations results in pronounced parallax, but it is the only means of preventing the optical delusion and of putting the concept of the power of knowledge in human nature into its true place. Now, what Kant is saying here is not the platitude that one should see things not only from one's own point of view, but also from the point of view of others. But the question is how to face a reality exposed through a parallax, through a difference. If one's subjective view is an optical delusion, then the objective perspective or the viewpoint of others cannot but be an optical delusion as well. And if the history of philosophy is nothing but the history of such reflections, then the history of philosophy itself is nothing but optical delusion. This means thinking isn't simply an act that is performed from a place between two poles, but instead it is the parallax, this in-between position that is irreducible to either positions, itself the place from within which thinking becomes possible. So Kant performed this critical oscillation in his own philosophy. He continuously confronted the dominant rationalism with empiricism and the dominant empiricism with rationalism. The Kantian critique exists precisely within this movement itself. The transcendental critique, or this position of critique, is not some kind of stable third position. It cannot exist without a constant transversal and transpositional movement. So coming back to the text, what is enlightenment? Reflection can indeed make us aware of things, of tradition, religion, family, society, the state, so on, but it can never release us from being gripped by their perspective. For Kant, it is critique as a speech act, and not as an introspective thought that is the sole method of enlightenment. Critique as a process of questioning what is and taking a stand from it. A range of thinkers after Kant have argued that Kant's idea of critique is simply impossible, that it is impossible to step out from one's own traditions, from what are the main constitutive factors of the subject. Stepping out of one's tradition for these critics of Kant would be like stepping out of one's language, stepping out of one's self. What some have considered a mere impossibility, Kant posited as the very condition of enlightenment itself. Now, the concept of critique for Kant is linked to progress. And progress is understood as this kind of undefined purposiveness. Even if something like progress cannot be proven, we can still discern signs to indicate that it is possible. This discernment of the possibility of progress does not lead us to a resolute position, but to a continuous movement of critique that is transpositional and transversal, always moving by exiting the given limits of a given situation. So what has been called Kant's transcendental critique is precisely this gesture of overturning an entire field of thinking, of not reducing the critique to either position in a given debate. Thus, Kant's Enlightenment is not reducible to a stage of development of European civilization, but it is about the gesture of executing a critique from a place beyond the given binaries of any situation. In fact, we are compromised in reading Kant's text from the present when we reduce it to a teleology of progress. It is important, however, for us to be honest about the failure of Kant's predictions for society. Even in his own age, he recognized the lack of an age of enlightenment. Recall in the text, or as you will see in the text this coming week, Kant's words, he says, "Do we now live in an enlightened age?" The answer is, for Kant, no. But we do live in an age of enlightenment, end of quote. So there must be enlightened people for the age to be called an age of enlightenment. There must be monsters, zombies, undeads for the age to be called the age of enlightenment. Even a revolution for Kant does not guarantee the true reform of ways of thinking, for it can bring down aristocratic despotism or oppression, but may not be able to overcome the inclinations that we have towards cowardice and immaturity, the inability to speak for oneself, to use one's own reason. Now, if we go to the very first sentence in the text, enlightenment is mankind's exit from self-incurred immaturity. And what is immaturity? The text goes on. Immaturity is the inability to make use of one's own understanding without the guidance of others, end of quote. So this immaturity, Kant argues, is self-incurred not because it is a lack of understanding, but because it is caused by a lack of courage and resolution to use one's own understanding. By claiming that this immaturity is self-incurred, Kant located the source of the problem within the self. In order to exit the state of immaturity, one must be able to carry out a process of an ethical critique of the self. One must overcome social restrictions and processes of individuation. The ethical has to become a process of reconstitution of the self. There is no excuse in saying that someone has put you in a condition of immaturity, Kant tells us. He writes in the introductory paragraph, "It is so easy to be immature," end of quote. So moving on in the text, Kant claims that it is formal academic education, the university, religion, and ideology that actively fend off maturity and make subjects fear it. The figures of the pastor, you will see in the text, the scholarly book, and the doctor are singled out by him as guardians who speak for the subject, as guardians who perpetuate a state of immaturity. And this is the quote on the slide. "I have a book that has understanding for me, a pastor who has a conscience for me, a doctor who judges my diet for me, and so forth. Surely I do not need to trouble myself. I have no need to think. If only I can pay, others will take over the tedious business for me. Those guardians who have graciously taken up the oversight of mankind take care that the far greater part of mankind, including the entire fairer sex, regard the step to maturity as not only difficult but also very dangerous," end of quote. Thus, immaturity has come to be considered the natural state of the subject, their understanding tethered to the ruse of mechanical and instrumental logic, like domestic animals tethered to carts, guided by them. So this path of exit from immaturity is only treaded at a very high cost by a mere few. It is almost a suicidal act. In other words, the cost of enlightenment is very high. one that many may not be able or willing to bear. However, Kant claimed that the true public enlightenment would only happen gradually through, and I quote him, the gradual reforms of the way of thinking in a society. He argued that even the overthrow of a monarch or an absolutist rule through a revolution would not be enough for enlightenment, because tyrannical power in society lies in the very structures of our thought. Again, a quote, I think it's on your handout at the back. A revolution may perhaps bring about the fall of an autocratic despotism and of an avaricious or overbearing oppression, but it can never bring about the true reform of a way of thinking. Rather, new prejudices will serve, like the old, as the leading strings of the thoughtless masses, end of quote. So after he makes the above argument, Kant presents us with the true factor of enlightenment, the secret factor of enlightenment, the freedom to make a public use of one's reason in all matters, end of quote. Now, this is certainly one of Kant's most famous and most misinterpreted statements. Liberals, for one, have made it into an argument for the separation of rights and duties in the social contract. It has been interpreted as an argument about the separation of legality and morality. It has as well been interpreted as an excuse for reasserting reason over irrationality, i.e., as in the West over other cultures. However, if we look at Kant's text closely, if we employ a close philological lens in reading the text, we would reach entirely different and contradictory conclusions. If enlightenment has to do with the reform of a way of thinking, as Kant has already stated, and not in the replacements of forms of representative powers in society with others, then enlightenment does not mean the further separation of the private from the public, but an overcoming of the private, of individual inclinations for something that is external to the self, outside it, foreign from it even. So nothing is required for enlightenment besides freedom, Kant tells us, the freedom to make public use of one's reason in all matters. Social and political institutions do not cease to command the subject to obey. Kant lists the state, the church, the Prussian king. They all command one to obey, and indeed one can obey. But in order to be free, the subject must undertake an act that shifts them from the particular conditions of their subjugation to a universal realm of reason. The public use of reason does not simply oppose the individual to their particular surrounding community, but opposes particular communal institutional belongings against a universal exercise of reason. So the task of the public use of reason for Kant was not to answer questions and solve problems, but to redefine the very grounds of problems themselves, to ask about the horizon of meaning, which is always already there, structuring our approach to reality and of which we are generally unaware. While Kant's contemporaries like Moses Mendelssohn were willing to concede that there might be certain unhappy circumstances in which philosophy must remain silent, Kant in this text was uncompromising in his insistence that the public use of reason should never be restricted. Public exercise of reason is an act that one does as a scholar before the entire public of the reading world. It is an act undertaken as a participation in the universal. So while the private use of reason, Kant describes as anything done as part of a certain mechanism, a certain mechanical model, such as in a civil post, in a school, in a society of clergymen, in the army. These are what he lists as private uses of reason. In order for a subject to practice a public use of reason, they must transcend their particular positions. So a clergyman who is critical of the system of the church can address the world as a scholar, uses public use of reason. A citizen who is critical of the taxation system can critique it from the position, again, of a scholar, exercising their public use of reason. The same goes for any other subject position in the apparatus of the social order. Kant explained, and I quote, "The touchstone of everything that can be concluded as a law for a people lies in the question, could a people have imposed such a law upon itself?" End of quote. And even if a people have instituted some law upon itself, law is always instituted for a brief time to introduce order and an expectation of what is better. Men work themselves, according to Kant, bit by bit out of immaturity, and at different paces. Not everybody is able to adhere to the public use of reason. So, thus, enlightenment is a qualitative transformation. It's not a quantitative one. The task of enlightenment is infinite, and humankind are perplexing creatures, finite, restricted to certain mechanisms. There is a dual role that subjects must play somehow. They must be passive, as machines following the natural law, and active, as ethical political subjects. So this split nature of the subject is the very same grounds of their freedom in Kant's formulation. Karl Marx takes Kant's categorical imperative, the imperative to act in a way in which the highest aim for man is man himself, or woman, woman herself, and extends it in his own critique of capitalist political economy. And this is a quote from Marx. The criticism of religion, begun with Kant, ends with the teaching that man is the highest being for man, hence with the categorical imperative to overthrow all relations in which man is a debased, enslaved, forsaken, despicable being, end of quote. So the plight of the modern subject is precisely this. They must obey the commands of social and political institutions, and in this obedience, there is essentially no freedom. And here it's important to note the stark contrast with figures like Adam Smith and Thomas Hobbes, that while for these thinkers they presumed the pursuit of self-interest to be the core of enlightened society, Kant argued that it is this very self-interest that paradoxically limits our freedom. So the paradox for Kant is that, and I quote him again, a high degree of civic freedom appears advantages for spiritual freedom, even if it places restrictions on it, and a low degree of civil freedom, of argue as much as you want but to obey, creates the room for spiritual freedom to spread to its full capacity, end of quote. Now, spiritual freedom for Kant is not equivalent to free thinking, and civic freedom does not appear to be conducive to true free thinking, true enlightenment. Frederick the Great may be a model prince, as you will see in the text. The 18th century may be in true need of some degree of spiritual freedom, but remember, it does not represent an enlightened age, but a potential for enlightenment that has to be actualized and not restricted to a form of religious freedom or an enlightened monarch only. So neither spiritual freedom nor freedom induced by a government are forms of true enlightenment, in which the public use of reason may question all laws that were already given. So for Kant, the very idea that everything is determined by natural cause is made possible by a position that brackets freedom, and conversely, only when determination by natural cause is bracketed can the idea of freedom intervene. The key is that one cannot explain everything from one and the same positionality, and that one should always seek a certain universality. And universality is not a simple coalition of common senses, but has to go against plural common senses, while still taking others into consideration. So the Enlightenment represented the unprecedented political venture to replace belief in authority as the basis of polity with human reason and knowledge. We can conclude with a young Hegel, who you will come to in the very end of this course, whom you will read again in a few weeks, who described the modern subject not as the light of the modern Enlightenment, but in Hegel's words, this night, this empty nothing, the uncanny Frankenstein that we cannot get rid of by reducing it to any positive substantial content, but by constantly assuming this position of thinking that is irreducible to the givens of any particular situation. Okay, and this is where the lecture actually ends. Yeah. Thank you. Can you